John Corby pulled the cloth covering his face tighter as he strode through the thick smoke and ash that permeated Sahula's city streets. In some places, the smoke was so dense he had to lead with his hands to avoid running into something face first. The light from Tiala Prime's star gave the city an eerie look from being filtered by the rising columns of smoke. Numerous fires burned all over the city, and no one was willing to risk the relative safety of any shelter they had found. Various odors saturated the smoke, which was stronger depending on how close you got to what was burning. Woods of several types made up the bulk of the smell, but there were also plastics, electrical and fiber optic wiring, paint, melting glass, and the faux rubber used as tires for the local conveyances. But there were other smells he tried not to think about. Those smells would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard the sound of laughter from up ahead. It wasn't a pleasant kind of laugh either. The terrified screams that came from the source of their laughter made him hurry as fast as he could. After being kicked or battered down, he came upon a door that was barely attached to the frame. Inside were 5 Threxiran soldiers surrounding a pair of Parkinian women cowering on the floor beneath them. The still forms of 3 other Parkinian males showed exactly what kind of fun they were having and the fate of the 2 women after the Threxirans were finished with them. He entered the room and shouted, "Don't touch those women!" as he strode up to the soldiers. He'd caught them by surprise, but they spun around quickly, weapons ready. His anger kept the urge to flee under control. He saw the look on their faces change from surprise to anger at their sport being interrupted. Corby pulled down his facial covering and glared at who he assumed was their leader. "Do you know who I am?" His voice steady with a hint of malice in it. The Threxirans took a step back from Corby. "Do you recognize what I am?" he demanded the leader, stammered while trying to answer Corby. Corby shouted at the leader again. "What was that? I can't hear you?" "A human, sir," he finally managed to get out. "Very good, and do you know the orders given by General Drian about humans?" Corby barked out. "Yes, sir. We are not to interfere or harm any humans," one of the other Threxirans said. "And did you get the new order that Parkinian see?" "Civilians were not to be harmed from now on," Corby asked, keeping his voice steady and menacing. "Under penalty of death?" The Threxirans all shook their heads in the negative reply. They were beginning to get too scared to even speak. Threxiran military justice for disobeying an order was swift and brutal. Corby pretended to think before speaking again. "Since you didn't know, I will spare your lives by not mentioning this disobedience to the general when we meet later." The soldiers began to express their gratitude, but Corby interrupted them. "I'm not finished." He pointed to a device on his torso. "This records and uploads everything in real time, so I will need to return to the campus and erase it." He gestured to the women. "Give them to me and I'll take them there. They won't be able to say anything and you can leave this area. Find a spot where more of your comrades are and pretend to do something official. That way, if anyone asks, they'll say you've been there all afternoon." The Threxirans once again talked over each other to thank him. "I'd also avoid officers in case someone else saw you here. They'll forget about those kinds of reports in a day or two. Now go." Corby finished. The soldiers saluted and practically tripped over each other as they fled out of the door. Corby looked at the 2 women. "Get dressed, grab some things, and follow me." While they gathered some possessions, he took the sheets off the beds and covered the 3 bodies. Once in the streets, he took each woman by the hand and led them through the smoke-shrouded streets. He also mentally thanked an old professor who advised him to take some dramatic speaking classes to improve his oration when giving lectures. It served him well in his years as a professor and then chancellor of the university he founded here. It also helped him bluff the Threxirans into obeying a non-existent order, and hopefully he'd persuaded them to lay low long enough to let him find and guide a few more civilians to the safe zone he had created at his university. The last thing the general or Threxiran leadership wanted was for the humans to interfere in this world's internal affairs, and he took advantage of that as far as he could and hoped none of the soldiers tried to check with their officers about it. Now that he was guiding 2 civilians to safety, he was glad for the smoke. He reached the university gates with no more incidents. He turned the women over to one of his students and sat to guzzle some water. One of the professors who was now guarding the gate came to check on him. "How did it go?" he asked. Corby looked up at his friend and fellow professor, Hake. It's a mess out there. You can hardly see more than 10 ft in front of you. He took another swig from the jug. And I had to bluff a group of Threxiran soldiers making sport of some civilians. I haven't always been thrilled with how intimidating my people can be, but I am damn thankful for it now. I bet, Hake replied before saying, You need to take a break and eat something. Corby thought, for a moment, I got enough time for one more run before it gets full dark. Hake looked at him and asked, Want me to go with you? Thanks, old friend, but it's better you stay here, Corby answered. If anything keeps those bastards out of the campus, it's a 3-meter-tall Devlonian with a big club in each of his 6 hands. It was almost midnight when he came back empty-handed. He decided to grab a quick bite and maybe a couple of hours of sleep. His eyes felt gritty from the smoke and lack of sleep. But sleep eluded him. Too much had happened in the last couple of days since a Threxiran army attacked the city. He thought of the devastation he'd seen and what it looked like when he first arrived in Sihula. It was 25 years ago that an idealistic young man came to this planet with grandiose ideas about creating a university to rival some of the best in the galaxy. He loved Tiala Prime from the moment he arrived, almost as much as he loved Earth. He loved hiking its verdant hills, the shades of purple, blue, and pink of the forests, and he loved the people. He had friends from both species that evolved. On this planet, he just wished the two races got along better. There was very little difference between the two physically. Many outsiders had trouble seeing those cues. The Parkinians and the Threxiar had been in conflict since they discovered each other. The Parkinians lived in the northern hemisphere, while the Threxiar controlled the southern one. Their entire history was filled with wars, death, and blood that put human history to shame. But there was hope when the humans made first contact and then introduced them to the many other races in the galaxy. For a time, the shock of learning they weren't alone caused them to set aside their differences and reap the benefits of contact. They later learned from others just how lucky they were to meet the humans first. While some of the races would have conquered and enslaved them, the humans preferred peaceful relations for trade and learning all they could to sate their voracious appetite for knowledge. They also tried not to meddle in the internal affairs of other races, but preferring peace did not make them opposed to war, as several species found out when humans first made contact with others, and so very few races would cross the humans, for something as minor as exploiting a new world. Humans rarely do things by half when it comes to warfare, which meant the people of Tiala Prime enjoyed the first extended period of peace in centuries. Led by the humans, many different races came to trade with both Parkinians and Threxiarans, and both peoples enjoyed prosperity, and Corby was one of those people that flocked to Tiala Prime. Being new to the galactic community offered new opportunities to create something not constrained by the traditional ideas of most other universities, and so he began to fulfill his dream in a Parkinian city close to their border with the Threxiar. With a view of the majestic mountains to the north and to the south was the meandering Nolobo River, its tranquil waters flowing clear and pure over the rocky bottom. The city of Sihula spanned both sides of the river with a pair of bridges connecting them. Its proximity to the border caused the city to flourish in trade, and the university brought in members of dozens of races to study, or just visit. The population exploded until 500,000 beings called Sihula home. Corby's pride and joy was located close to the river, its vast campus surrounded by low walls and towers to look like something from the folklore of both peoples. Vines cascaded down the walls in shades of green and pink over the yellow stone walls. The towers were places to study the night sky, conduct experiments that needed solitude, or just take in the beauty around them. Stately buildings were surrounded by stunning gardens that gave the campus a serene atmosphere. Traders, merchants, scholars, businesses, and craftsmen flocked to Sihula. The rise of merchants and traders began influencing their respective governments to avoid large conflicts. After all, they were bad for business. A lasting peace brought in even more business. All of this brought prosperity and fame to the city on the river. And that prosperity led the city elders to lavish vast sums to make Sihula the jewel of Tiala Prime. But prosperity also breeds jealousy, and jealousy can breed hatred. Greed begets more greed, and some would stoop to almost anything to protect what they have or obtain more. The Threxier nobility hungered for the old ways of blood and battle. This left them vulnerable to manipulation by the newly rich traders and merchants. And in turn, the nobles encouraged the lower classes to follow their lead. They tried to stir the old hatred by claiming the Parkenians were preventing them from enjoying the same level of prosperity, claiming wealthy Parkenians were stealing Threxiran children and forcing them into servitude in their households. Threxiran entertainment channels brought out the old insulting names of their rivals. Caches of weapons were said to be hidden all over the country and border towns. There were rumors of Threxiran men training in the countryside, far from prying eyes. But there were always rumors claiming that, so why listen to them now? Corby had also heard the rumors several times since he moved here, but this time, something felt different. He could not quite place it, and it worried him. An appointment with the city elders led him to the city center, and the feeling just got worse. And then he thought back several days before when it began. Corby had gone back to his office to make some calls when his assistant burst in. An army of Threxiarans just crossed the border and heading this way. 2 other armies had crossed the border near other cities as well. How long before they get here? Corby asked. Less than an hour, his assistant replied. He took a moment to think before speaking. There is nothing close enough to stop them in time, but maybe I can delay them, he stated. They won't want humans to get involved. He turned to his assistant. While I am gone, round up anyone you can find and hang or paint flags of the Terran Union. If nothing else, we can try and make this a safe zone to protect the people. Corby got into his vehicle and set out to meet this army. If it was just a mob, maybe he could scare them with threats of a human response to their actions. But he was dismayed when he got a view of the Threxiarans. The Threxiaran army accompanied the mob of armed militia. The Threxiaran officers and nobles knew about the human policy of non-interference in internal matters. There was no way to bluff them, but he remembered something from an old history text, and so he was brought before the leader of this army, General Dryan. It took some fast talking, but he managed to convince the general to respect the university grounds as a safety zone, but for civilians only. He explained that while the humans wouldn't respond to an internal conflict, they would respond if anything happened to him, the other humans, and all the aliens on campus. But he had to agree that military-age Parkinian men were not allowed inside, but he convinced him to allow those on staff to remain. Corby hoped to slip more of the male civilians, but the general was shrewd. He sent an officer to inspect and record their ID papers. Corby barely remembers what happened after his meeting. It was just a whirlwind of images in his mind. Stocking, up supplies, gathering refugees, and closing the campus off except for the main gate and a small door on each of the other walls. The Threxiarans announced their arrival by raining down explosives on the parts of Sehula south of the river. You could track the army's progress by the fires they started. Scores of refugees crowded the 2 bridges across the river. They were packed so tight on them that some were accidentally knocked off into the water. Swimming wasn't a common skill among the Parkinian, and only a few made it to the shore. From one of the towers, Corby and the others watched in horror as the Threxiarans reached the bridges. The refugees crammed on the bridges never had a chance. Their cries were terrible to hear, and the river ran green from all the blood spilled in it. Once the Threxiarans reached the bridges, the river became choked with the bodies of the living, and the dead thrown from the bridges. He saw the bodies of children among the bodies carried downriver by the stream. Corby was so upset that he called the Terran embassy and described exactly what happened. When the embassy contacted him after they talked to the Terran government, it was just as he feared. They refused to interfere in an internal matter. He wanted to rage against the bearer of bad news, but he heard the same mix of sorrow and anger in their voice as his. So instead, he relayed the plans for the safe zone and recommended implementing it in other cities. With no one to resist them, the city fell in a matter of hours. Corby hoped the worst was over, but it had just begun. Any control of the mob of Threxiaran militia and soldiers was lost within hours of the city's fall. Armed gangs of Threxiarans roamed the streets, looting, burning, murdering, torturing, and assaulting the civilian population. Throngs of Parkinian men were rounded up and marched off to entertain Threxerans in manners that made death a blessing. Slowly but surely, the officers began to regain control of their men, and the militia was brought into line. At least during the day, groups of Threxerans still roamed the streets, hoping to catch an unwary civilian to make sport of. And every night, Corby alone or with Hake accompanying him would head out into the streets to try and prevent that from happening. He talked, bluffed, bribed, wheedled, or threatened, especially when Hake was with him. It took a very brave man to stand up to a human and a Devlonian carrying multiple clubs, and tried to save as many as they could. Corby and the other humans and aliens worked around the clock to treat and care for the tens of thousands of refugees that sheltered on campus. This continued for over a week before the humans and other members of the galactic community finally took steps to end this conflict. At great risk to itself, a Strikax managed to smuggle out a data cube filled with images and video of the atrocities committed. It got the cube to the Terran embassy and had an unblocked communication channel. The Threxerans had jammed the rest but weren't willing to risk cutting the Terran embassy off completely. Those images finally shamed the galactic community to take action. A fleet of warships in orbit is a wonderful incentive to make peace. It took years for Sahula to regain his former glory, and it would take decades of physical, mental, and emotional healing for the survivors. The staff of the safety zone took solace in saving tens of thousands of civilians from the Threxerans. For Corby and others, there was no healing from the things they did and saw. So they focused on bringing as many of the war criminals to justice as they could. And they weren't too picky about their condition when they turned them over to the authorities. Author's note: I don't think it's that good, but I wanted to use it as an excuse to introduce several men that I greatly admire. The main influence is John Robb, a man that worked for a German company as their representative in China. Ironically enough, he was a member of the Nazi Party when, along with others, they created a safety zone in Nanking, during the Japanese taking of the city in 1937. He used his status as a member of the Nazi Party to shield Chinese civilians from the rampaging Japanese troops, and even rescue a few from drunken Japanese soldiers. Upon returning to Germany, he tried to share what happened with lectures and plenty of evidence he smuggled out. He even tried to write Hitler to stop the Japanese atrocities. That earned him a visit from the Gestapo, and only intervention by his company saved him. His life after that is pretty sad. Enjoy another story. General Naram Sin surveyed the battlefield with apprehension and a creeping feeling of helplessness. He'd been tasked with halting the advance of the Vroskil on the capital of the Keishi homeworld by the order of the Galactic Coalition's Grand Council. He'd been given command of a coalition grand army of 500,000 soldiers that contained a contingent from every member of the coalition, as had been their tradition for centuries. An army of this size had not been gathered in over 200 galactic years, and he expected to overawe the Vroskil into surrendering or flight. But they hadn't been that accommodating. The Vroskil had appeared on the border of coalition space about 2 galactic years ago with claims of friendship and trade. They said one of their probes came across a derelict Tato exploration ship that had suffered a catastrophic decompression after something pierced their hull in several places, possibly an asteroid storm. None of the crew survived, but the computer core was intact and let them determine the ship's origin. They said they wanted to return the bodies of the crew, but the ship was too damaged and broke up while being towed to a station. And so this gesture led to the Tato and the Galactic Coalition welcoming them with open arms. Or most of them, anyway. The humans were reserved in their dealings with the Vroskil, but the Council assumed it was because the humans only recently joined the Coalition. They just didn't know any better, many of the Grand Councilors said. They brushed aside their concerns without even listening to them. Others thought they were jealous of the trade deals the newcomers were making, especially the markets the humans had yet to gain access to. Eventually, the humans gave up on their attempts to advise caution in dealings with the Vroskilet. Was 6 months ago they found out that humans were right not to trust them. A Vroskil armada crossed the border into Tato space to devastate their homeworld and several colony worlds. There were few survivors, and those that did reported outages in subspace communication and power grids. After determining the same thing happened at the same time on the other colony worlds, it became obvious they were sabotaged by the Vroskil. All their claims of wanting peaceful trade were just an excuse to scout coalition defenses and future targets. 4 systems fell before the sluggish coalition military tried to fight back. But having been at peace for over a century meant their navies were better suited to fight pirates than full-size warships. Once again, the humans tried to warn them, but they weren't as technologically advanced as the rest of the coalition forces. So what did they know? Even after a Vroskil fleet attacked a human colony world but was driven off by a smaller human fleet, they called it luck and a diversion on the Vroskil's part. The coalition lost every engagement against the Vroskil in space and on the ground. Over the last several decades of peace, their military had become what the humans dismissively called a parade ground army. Human officers would say they looked good during ceremonies, but their training was woefully inadequate, out of date, and far too reliant on advanced technology. Once again, the coalition military high command ignored their advice. Humans still used projectile weapons. What do such primitive people know? And despite their offers of assistance, the humans were not asked to join in combat operations with the rest of the coalition military. They were told to stay and guard their worlds. The high command just said they only needed more men, ignoring the reports of the few survivors of battles that their tactics were inadequate to deal with the constantly shifting tactics of the Vroskil. No matter how perfectly they followed the plans devised by the high command, the Vroskil just found a weak spot and exploited it. The invasion of the Keshi homeworld finally convinced the high command to invite the humans to fight with them. Rumors spread that it was only because they needed the numbers. They were told to only send a contingent, not their whole military to assist. The humans shrugged their shoulders and sent a single division of 50,000 soldiers and support units, letting them be practically self-sufficient with their own heavy weapons, transports, medical units, and others. And so the largest fleet the Grand Coalition has assembled in centuries set out for Keshi and dropped out of FTL to find a Vroskil fleet already in orbit. Troop transports began to make planetfall while the warships engaged the Vroskil. The human warships were on the far right end of the battle line and drove into the Vroskil flank before they were fully deployed. The Vroskil knew what was going to happen if they stayed after the humans broke their far left and started to lap around behind the others, so they disengaged and fled the field. The fleet admiral thought they'd fled his superior numbers. The humans didn't waste time trying to correct him. General Naram Sin watched his army disembark with satisfaction, decked out in their gleaming body armor, marching off the ships in step, lined up in neat rows and presented their pulse rifles, just like they were on the parade ground before the high command. Well, except the humans, their body armor was a dull green, and several of them trotted off in different directions. Others helped unload their equipment of archaic weapons. Their weapons fired small projectiles via chemical propulsion. There were vehicles with long tubes sticking out the top. They called it a self-propelled gun. And they had a variety of other weapons, even some type of knife. How primitive they were. General Naram Sin had no idea what to do with them, so he left them to guard the landing ships. The human officer seemed annoyed but saluted and told his troops to dig in. The humans began digging all kinds of holes around the ships, but the general didn't understand why. Were they going to hide from the enemy? How cowardly of them. Once all of his troops had disembarked, he formed them into a column and went out to find the enemy, minus the humans, of course. They looked impressive in their shining body armor and perfectly ordered columns. The Vroskil would take one look at his vast numbers and run away. He was sure of it and took no effort to send out scouts on his flanks. He didn't need them since his hand scanners would suffice. His sensors finally found the enemy army, and it wasn't even 1/4 of the army he led. He deployed his troops into a battle line and marched to meet the enemy. His army finally caught sight of the hated Vroskil. The Vroskil fired a few shots before they turned and ran away. General Naram Sin laughed when he saw them run away. He knew it, but they wouldn't get away. He ordered his army to chase them, and being the fastest race in the army, ordered the Norcane contingent to catch them and pin them down until the rest of the army caught up. With the Norcane sprinting ahead, he ordered his troops into 4 columns and followed at the double quick. He smiled at the idea of his quick victory, and in the blink of an eye, everything changed. They'd just passed where they first saw the Vroskil lined up when the fleeing enemy turned around and opened fire on the Norcane chasing them. It was like they ran into a buzzsaw and hundreds went down. Caught by surprise, his army stopped their pursuit and then the other shoe dropped. Vroskil soldiers popped up out of their hiding spots and sent a fusillade of shots into both flanks of his army. Their energy weapons pierced his troops' armor with ease, and they'd barely begun to return fire when the ground erupted around them when the Vroskil set off the hidden explosive charges they placed underground. This was the last straw for the untested army, and it shattered into its component pieces. It was every contingent for themselves. General Naram Sin managed to keep his people's contingent of Shirian troops, along with 3 other races together, leaving him with a quarter of the troops he started with. All the others panicked and ran. The Vroskil gleefully shot them down in great numbers. The general hoped that his group could retreat and escape in good order during the chaos, but there were far more Vroskil than he imagined with shots from behind telling him they were almost surrounded. He tried to call for help, but all he got was static. The Vroskil was probably jamming his comm channels. Not knowing what else to do, he ordered his troops to take cover in the blast holes created by the explosions. The only saving grace for his reduced command is there were so many fleeing coalition soldiers that not all of the Vroskil fire was directed at them. But his troops were slowly being whittled down by the accurate Vroskil fire. Their heavier weapons made this terrifying thunderclap when fired. Its psychological impact was almost more dangerous than the energy bolts it fired. He could see the increasing panic on the faces of the troops he had left. General Naram Sin said a silent prayer to his ancestors to prepare himself for the end. He didn't even notice the new sounds on the battlefield, a series of pops, cracks, and other noises he couldn't describe. A moment later, he heard a whistling noise followed by a huge boom coming from the massive fountains of dirt tossed up in the air by artillery fire. He peeked over the edge of the hole he was in to see hundreds of humans firing into the startled Vroskil. He was amazed as he watched them moving forward, with one group of humans running forward and flopping to the ground. While they were firing on the Vroskil, another group of humans ran past them and took cover. They began firing at the enemy, and the first group ran past them, took cover, and fired at the enemy. They kept this up until they nearly reached the Vroskil position. Their dull armor also made them harder to see, and only a few were hit by the pitiful Vroskil return fire. General Naram Sin enjoyed the screams and wailing coming from the Vroskil as the humans attacked them from several directions. The Vroskil were used to having their own way in their fights with the coalition. They were caught completely by surprise and had no idea how to respond. They made a critical error in a combat situation and were left with only 2 options: flee or die in place. Those who hesitated were lost as more and more humans reached the battlefield. It took less than a quarter hour to finish off the last of the Vroskil. Human medics began to scour the field for those wounded they could still save. A human approached him, saluted in their fashion, and identified himself as Colonel Sellers, Terran Marines. General Naram Sin returned the salute with a huge sense of relief and thanked the colonel with effusive praise. "So one of my messages got through?" he asked. "Messages? We didn't get any messages." The colonel replied, "How did you know to come here and save us?" A confused General Naram Sin asked, "Our commander saw some of the fleeing troops heading for the dropships and thought something went wrong." The colonel replied, "So he dispatched my command to link up with you. Which officer told you how to find us? It might balance out his fleeing." The general angrily asked, "Sir?" The colonel asked, looking confused. "Oh, no one, sir." "No one? Then how did you know where to find us? The Vroskil had jammed all my comm channels and I couldn't broadcast our location." An increasingly confused general asked. The colonel smiled and replied, "An old Terran military maxim, sir. In the absence of any other orders, always march to the sound of the guns." The general mulled it over for a second before replying, "It seems you humans know more about war than I assumed." Addressing the colonel, "Well, Colonel, I think I need to look into this more, so take me to your leader." At this, several nearby humans broke into laughter. The colonel silenced them but couldn't completely hide his amusement as he said, "Yes, sir. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think."